This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at BakerStreetIrregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the Greek interpreter interpreted, the Norwood builder built, and the Reigate squires puzzled, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
How many disguises did Sherlock Holmes use? What were the street Arabs? And how did he get information from his underground network?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 223, Brain Fever. Well, hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we talk about the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, I've had you on the brain all week long. It's been, such a trying week. And I feel faint, like I'm heading toward the fainting couch. Can you help?
Yes. Go down to IKEA and purchase one of their brand new fainting couches. And after you get through the instructions with those little Swedish wrenches, after an hour and a half, you'll need a fainting couch.
An hour and a half. And that's only for the first leg on the couch.
Yes.
Yeah. I was
completing the first leg on the couch. We joined the race already in progress.
You know, that would make for an interesting pandemic game show. Send 4 different contestants a piece of IKEA furniture and put them on a Zoom call and see who can assemble it first.
Well, I like that, but maybe there's more to do. Could we combine it with a 100-yard dash? I want to see how many people can assemble the frame while
there you go.
Dashing for 100.
So the winner would get a bag of Swedish meatballs, and the loser would get 3 more pieces of furniture from IKEA.
No, you need to get 2 more boxes of cereal with shrimp in it.
I don't think that's a Swedish specialty. It's purely American. Well, we are.
Wait a minute now. I'm going to call Ingrid Bergman, and I don't think she'll return my calls anymore.
Well, we're not here to talk about IKEA furniture, nor are we here to talk about cinnamon shrimp crunch. We are here to talk about Sherlock Holmes. So if you would like the show notes for this episode, you can find it at ihose.co/trifles223, all lowercase. That will take you to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com site to exactly where this show lands. You can find all kinds of other things there, including links to our sponsors and ways to support the show by a rating and review on your favorite podcasting listening app of choice, or by PayPal or Patreon for as little as $1 a month to help keep the show going. We value Sherlockian discussion and diatribes here, and that is what we aim to give you show after show. Well, we promised you an episode about brain fever, and I suppose before we get into the canonical appearances of brain fever and their significance, it might actually serve us well to define what brain fever is. Now, Bert, I don't know if you're anything like me, but when I was a young boy reading the Sherlock Holmes stories, and I came across the fact that there was some heroine, usually a heroine, who was suffering from brain fever, I thought, well, what is that? We have no current medical terminology where one can be diagnosed with brain fever. And we have a few sources at hand, some Sherlockian scholarship, to help inform us on this. So what say you? How should we be thinking about brain fever?
Well, in its time, and the lovely thing about this is whenever we talk about the canon and the work of Arthur Conan Doyle, we're in this wonderful world of Victorian literature. And if you ever pick up a 19th century novel, you're going to find the brain fever afflicts a great number of Victorian era characters. And, you could say to yourself, gee, this just seems like a very handy recurring plot device. Because when you look at different books, for example, Madame Bovary, she reads this spoiler alert for Madame Bovary.
Uh-oh.
She reads this brutal breakup letter from her great lover and suffers brain fever. And I think even in Dickens, in Great Expectations, Pip becomes very ill after his father figure dies. And people generally contract this brain fever after experiencing intense emotions. But it didn't mean a high temperature to Victorians, but it was sort of this collection of symptoms that were somehow based in the brain as they perceived it. So, it was characterized by headache, by flushed skin, by delirium, by being sensitive to light and sound. And, it's unclear if all these roots had some sort of links to anything that was contagious, but it was generally thought that a big emotional shock or excessive intellectual activity. You can imagine someone toiling over the New York Times Sunday crossword, producing, what's wrong, Warren? It's my brain fever, Carol. This 73 across is infernal. Infernal, that's exactly the right word. Is that EL or AL?
Well, the idea that people suffered from headache and particularly inflammation in the cranial region was not something new in Victorian times. In a couple of sources here, we find that Hippocrates from about 400 BC mentions phrenitis with a PH, phrenitis, which is literally translated as inflammation of the brain. And in 200, Soranus of Ephesus described fever and delirium, which he called phrenitis or cerebritis. So already, we're seeing observations and what is the Sherlockian canon about, but observation and deduction. We're seeing observations by medicos in history that people did occasionally suffer from an inflamed brain, right? And it goes further than just being a headache.
Yeah, you have to wonder if it's connected at all to migraine, which has, if you have not experienced a migraine, it's very difficult to comprehend how different a migraine can be from a headache. But clearly, clearly it's something going on here. I don't mean to suggest that, it's just completely imaginary. It's just that when you're reading Victorian novels, particularly women seem to be afflicted by, and that's why there's a fainting couch,
Right.
And the old diagnosis or another diagnosis used to be neurasthenia, which I think was actually a real diagnosis that was retired some years ago. But
similarly, hysteria, which is a female specific term. When you say someone is hysterical, it's actually traced in the language to. You of course have heard of hysterectomy. That's when the uterus is taken out. So a lot of this seems to be gender specific in its history. I should mention that we have two sources we're working from for this episode. One is volume 41, number 2 of the Baker Street Journal, which contains the aptly named article "Brain Fever" by Stephen Tollins, who was an MD and a fellow of the American Academy of Surgery, and a longtime Baker Street irregular. And we have two other BSIs who wrote "Brain Fever: Myth or Reality." It was one of the chapters in Nerve and Knowledge, Doctors, Medicine, and the Sherlockian Canon. Those, of course, are Enrico Solito, MD, and Stefano Guerra, MD. Now, these latter two mention that this description of delirium, often associated with fever, is due to an imbalance between the several humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, according to Hippocrates. And it was triggered by several causes, including sun exposure or stress. Now, if you've ever had sunstroke, been out in the sun too long, not had any sunscreen on, you will recognize that as one of the factors that you come in, you've got a terrible headache. And I'm a migraine sufferer myself, so I've had sunstroke once or twice, and it is akin to a migraine where you feel this incredible pressure. You want to just retreat to a dark room. You just want to try and sleep it off. There's nothing else that will touch it. And so when we see these characters in various stories, not just Sherlock Holmes stories, but as you mentioned, Madame Bovary, yes, it's a plot device. And it also conveniently allows them to retreat, right? To be able to withdraw from society or from their companions for a while and tend to their physical well-being.
Mm. Well, I mean, it's a great point, and we should underscore the fact that, sickness is a scary thing, and 19th century doctors didn't have access to antibiotics, and they didn't understand how contagion worked. So just because some of these descriptions seem old-fashioned today doesn't mean that the whole thing was made up. There were a lot of terrors, involving these kinds of conditions no one understood. And in some cases, I think people have observed that these kinds of diagnoses, brain fever, neurasthenia, and so on, could have been related to inaccurate descriptions of things like meningitis. Whose diseases, were not, really particularly, well defined. And of course, this is a time too when people are getting things like scarlet fever. And, these kinds of fevers are,
well,
they're in the streets and therefore they're in the novels.
Well, right. And some of those are contagious, but, when you've got a stress-induced sickness, that is obviously very specific to an individual. And I think some of the more modern terminology that we would recognize today comes from the DSM-5, which is the handbook for the diagnosis of mental disorders. Acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder are two very common ones that you'll hear about today in modern times. And when we look at the canon, well, there were some people who went through some very, very stressful events. So we will pick up on exactly who those people were and what those events were that may have triggered brain fever right after this word. In 2021, the BSI Press features 3 new volumes. That's right, 3 volumes, including one from the manuscript series, one from the Professions series, and one dedicated to the outgoing head of the BSI. First, the manuscript series, you'll hear about the Staunton tragedy, that is, the missing 3/4. Mike Whalen, the former head of the BSI, has edited this book in which a number of authors take aim at the missing 3/4. You'll learn about rugby, you'll learn about the mystery, you'll learn about, many things in the latest manuscript series. And in the latest Professions series, Michael Quigley and Marcia Pollock edit this volume that brings together corporals, colonels, and commissionaires as they look at military in the canon. And the third volume is A Quiet Air of Mastery, essays in honor of Mike Whalen as he steps down as the head of the Baker Street Irregulars, and that's edited by Les Klinger. All of these and more are available at BakerStreetIrregulars.com under the BSI Press section. Be sure to pick up your copy today. And we're back, and it should be noted that we are using as one of our reference books today in this discussion, Nerve and Knowledge, Doctor's Medicine and the Sherlockian Canon from the BSI Press Professions series. So you want to be sure to check that out as well. So in this particular piece, and this is an interesting bit of trivia, who mentions brain fever in the canon? When we come across the actual terminology, when we hear brain fever described, who is it that tells us that brain fever is affecting people?
Well, there are a couple of appearances in the canon of the word Percy, and one is around the case of Percy Phelps, which is probably the best documented case of brain fever in the canon. Mm-hmm. One thing I just wanted to say, though, before we get into Percy Phelps, is that one of the nice things in Steve Toland's article in the BSJ, which you mentioned, is that he reviewed some of the names of fevers. Bawamba fever, Dum-Dum fever, Kew Gardens spotted fever, Yangtze Valley fever. And it's in that context that we find brain fever described as an inflammation of the brain or meninges or both. But when you get to Percy Phelps, Dr. Watson tells us the predisposing factors. Percy was a studious young man. He was a nervous, sensitive boy at school. And then the sudden, severe emotional shock of the disappearance of the secret, extremely important treaty. So he has a sudden onset with fits and then becomes a raving maniac. And finally, 9 weeks unconscious and raving with brain fever, with weakness and slow clearing. And, of course, we're talking about the naval treaty here with Percy Phelps.
Poor Percy. I mean, he was so afflicted by, the loss of the treaty. And remember, this is a young man who is hoping for a life in civil service. His uncle is well regarded, a member of the of the British aristocracy, and here Percy is losing the very document that his uncle entrusted to him to potential great scandal and even war. He was completely eaten up about it, and he was in that room on that couch, that makeshift hospital bed, for what was it, 9-10 weeks?
That's a long time.
Incredible. And
9 weeks.
And he clearly wasn't getting any better during that time because they hadn't found the document. Right? So here was this stressor that was continuing to weigh upon him. And it's funny, we know that that famous scene at the denouement of the naval treaty when Holmes has Percy Phelps lift the lid in front of him at Baker Street, and there under that silver lid is not breakfast, but it is the naval treaty. And I just think in the Granada series, his reaction was perfect. I mean, he's thrilled to see it, but then he just has another relapse, another breakdown, because he was still quite weak from his brain fever. And we neglected to say this earlier on, but another common term for people who are in this kind of mental state that needs some kind of medical attention, institutionalization, etc., has traditionally been nervous breakdown. And I think that acknowledges that, the brain is the engine behind the nervous system, and many organs can be affected. Many of the humors, as Hippocrates observed, can be affected. So it is literally a breakdown of what's going on in the nervous system.
It's true.
So
and if you look in other corners of the canon too, you will find examples of things that relate to this set of conditions or set of weaknesses or set of symptoms. For example, in Sign of 4, we meet Thaddeus Sholto. And now Thaddeus is sort of a hypochondriac. Watson describes him as having a high piping voice, and he usually only raises his voice to complain about the state of, something that's, urgent or tragic going on. But he has all these physical characteristics. He's closeted away from the rest of the world. He describes himself as a great sufferer. He shrinks from all forms of rough materialism. He rarely leaves his apartment because of the state of his nerves. And, Watson sees all this before Sholto even begins to speak. He says Sholto, rides his hands together as he stood. His features were in a perpetual jerk. He shivered from head to foot. And so he's got these tremors that seem to have a psychological rather than a physical cause. And, Sholto is heavily guarded. He doesn't really have any reason to fear anything. And so, you've got these sort of classic mental, psychological, and again, this is years before William James. This is sort of the psychological landscape of these diagnoses.
Yeah. I think there's a few other instances of people who didn't suffer from brain fever by specific name in the canon, but again, were affected. I think of, Mrs. Ferguson in The Sussex Vampire. She again, spoiler alert, if you haven't read The Sussex Vampire, stop, right? Go read it, come back. She found that her stepson was trying to poison her baby, and was greatly affected by it, and sucked the poison out to try and save it, and did, obviously. But here she was with a great mental internal debate. Do I do what I have to do to protect my baby? Do I inform my husband that his firstborn son is trying to kill his secondborn? She clearly loves her husband. Her husband clearly loves his sons. How is she to break this to him? That must have been some kind of mental anguish for a woman trying to process this on her own.
Mm. Well, and also we've got Rachel Howells, from the Musgrave Ritual.
Sure.
Watson tells us she had a sharp touch of brain fever after Brunton dies, and she's got symptoms of hysteria and shrieks of laughter, and she screams and sobs for 2 days. And then Hattie Duran in The Noble Bachelor, she is suddenly told that her husband, who's off prospecting for gold, was killed by Apaches, which is never good news. And she said, we learn that she fainted dead away and was very sick for months after. Mm. And, and there are, many more of these.
Yeah. Well, and interestingly, one of the treatments for brain fever at the time, from 1832, was a cold dash, which consists of cutting off the hair and continuously dripping cold water on the head of the patient, which really sounds like Chinese water torture when you think about it. Is the cure worse than the disease itself? But who was it whose father worried her into oblivion and whose hair was cut short? But Alice Rucastle in The Copper Beeches, hence why Violet Smith had to cut her hair short when she got to the Copper Beeches.
Yeah, and there are many others. In The Crooked Man, Nancy Barclay, daughter of a career soldier, a churchgoer, a pillar of the community, but seeing her first love return, the noble Corporal Henry Wood, and witnessing the sudden death of her husband after learning of his vile deed, becomes temporarily insane from an attack of brain fever. Mm.
Well, to finish up here, we'll take the words from Doctors Guerra and Salito. How could Watson a modern doctor, particularly interested in neurology, still put trust in it and describe brain fever in his stories. Simply put, he didn't. Please read the canon again and pay attention to who really speaks about brain fever. In the Copper Beeches, a maidservant, Mrs. Toller, makes the diagnosis. In The Crooked Man, it's by Holmes himself in his recapitulation of the case, as at the end of the cardboard box. In the Musgrave Ritual, the diagnosis is made by Reginald Musgrave, and in the Naval Treaty, by the patient himself, Percy Phelps. Not one of them, not one, was medically competent, including Holmes, who normally delegates medical affairs to Watson. Yes, Watson could have corrected Holmes, but if you were in his shoes, would you dare? We are quite sure about Holmes's reply. Well, my dear Watson, if you're so acute as to explain to me that I am in the wrong, then and that brain fever doesn't exist, are you surely able to solve the case yourself? Say not another word.
Well, what Watson really should have done was consult someone with a little bit more current medical knowledge, like his literary agent, to get some advice about these things before they were published. But that would have been a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Well, when she wouldn't do it, he kept worrying her, till she got brain fever. For 6 weeks, she was at death's door. When she got better at last, all worn to a shadow and with a beautiful hair cut off, he moved her to the turret room, where she was kept, prisoner.